The sun's coming up. My drink is gone, but now it's time for our first cup. Today, I wanted to give you a heads up that there's a blackout in Cuba. Yeah, you heard me right. As of the time of this recording, there's no power in Cuba, at least from their power grid. It's left the 10 or so million citizens and thousands of tourists and foreign workers relying on generators and relying on going to places that tourists go to a lot, like full service resorts, to be able to charge their phones. It's been this way for a couple of days. And I can't imagine that things are getting easier there right now. I'm thinking about stuff like food storage, refrigeration. I'm hoping that their sanitation systems, whatever's running those pumps, has a lot more than a couple of days worth of backup fuel. But I don't know. It's hard to know because so much of the situation with the news there can't necessarily be directly trusted from official sources. If you know what I mean. You know, people on the ground, it's a different story, but if they don't have access to the internet or satellites or something, who knows? Now, if you've ever met me in person and you're an American, after knowing me for a little bit, I will tell you that one of the things that you need to do as an American is visit Cuba. Because I feel like, especially if you're around that age where you're cognizant of like the wall coming down, Berlin Wall. Someone doing wheelies in a golf cart or something, I don't know. But if you're of a certain age and you remember the wall coming down, that means that you were probably subjected to a lot of opinions and ideas and thoughts about what Cuba was, right? This very close island neighbor that was a dictatorship, a hellhole. And I won't necessarily refute the experiences of the people who told me that, right? I'm sure that the Cuba that they left had a lot of that going on. There's ample historical record to show that a lot of terrible things happened there. And that the government of Cuba did a lot of things that American interests could not ignore. But I still think people should go because there's a difference between a government and its people. You know, when I went, it was actually a business trip. It was under some Obama-era regulations that had not yet been rolled back. Or Obama-era, I don't know, it wasn't regulations, but essentially the border was opened up for business a bit more. And so I was down there to meet with a couple of guys who were trying to start up Cuba's first independent video game development studio. They're working on a game called Savior. They were cool guys. You know, and just getting to meet them and talk with them and hear about their process was actually pretty cool, right? The internet in the country at the time wasn't great, so they couldn't work on their project in the way that like you or I might think about working on it here in the States, right? Where you upload your files to like a shared drive or something, and you've got high-speed internet that makes it easy for people, you know, hundreds of miles or kilometers apart to have access to each other's work. But no, these guys, the internet that they had access to, even though they had access to it as students, wasn't fast enough to be able to do that. So what did they do? They met each other once a week. They each took buses, 150-ish kilometers, I think, for about each of them, every week, and they met up and they swapped hard drives. They would go to a cafe, they'd talk about the project, they'd swap hard drives with each other's work, take those hard drives and go back home and keep working. It was really cool to hear about and really cool to see, right? I met up with them one day when they had kind of met in the middle. And that's not the only thing that I saw in Cuba that really kind of inspired me. Because, again, growing up when I did, talking to people who were Cuban refugees, they talked about all the terrible things that happened under the Castro regime, right? People losing property in their lives and this and that and the other. And I mean, I saw some of the effects of that, right? Like when I went to bars, and saw the rum that was there, and learning about the history of the distillery, because it was a state-owned distillery, but that was formerly a Bacardi distillery. Yes, the Bacardi that you may know from your local bar. That was seized by the state, and a lot of things were seized by the state. A lot of people's, families' stuff was seized by the state. But also, I saw a lot of people doing incredible things with what they had. I don't know why this one particular instance sticks out in my head, but I went to some little cafe that was being run out of someone's little casita. And there was a trash can there, like cafes have, but it was a trash can that had just like a lid on top of it, not, something you just like push a flap and throw away, right? So you had to lift up the lid, throw out your junk or whatever. Oops, tap my watch. Anyway, you had to lift up the lid to throw out your junk. And the lid on this thing, it was kind of stapled together. It had like a seam of staples, like if you've ever seen the staples that they use to kind of suture a wound, right? It looked like those thick ass kind of medical or crafting staples, but they had sutured this cracked lid, and it was done really well. It wasn't just kind of like stapled together like haphazardly. It was done with care and with craft. And I saw a lot of that in Cuba. Just about everywhere that I went where someone had something that they were running or that they were doing, there was care and craft. Whether it was a casa particular, whether it was a cafe, whether it was a video game. That craft was everywhere. I mean, touristy grift was everywhere too. Let's be clear about that, right? Like, especially being this pale. But the craft was evident in so many things. And I guess that's something that really stuck out to me, because nobody had ever talked about that here in the States when they were talking about what they had escaped from, right? Going to Cuba really taught me that the perspective that I had gotten was of people who had left the island. And yes, they had risked their lives to leave the island, most of them. And a lot of them had reasons for leaving the island and risking their lives. But when I got to Cuba, when I talked to the people, when I experienced the people who were there, it became quite clear that the perspective of those who left was certainly not the perspective of those who stayed. I'm not saying that to offer judgment on one side or the other, but merely to illustrate that they were different perspectives. And being a kid in post-Cold War America, growing up in post-Cold War America, I'd only gotten one of those perspectives. And that's really what I find myself thinking about right now. With everything else going on in the world. Again, at the time of recording, we have an active war in Ukraine. There's an active war, I don't know if it's been officially called a war, but we have active military action in the Middle East with Israel and Iran and Hezbollah. We have people, citizens, suffering in all of those places. We have an election that's going to happen here, and we've got a lot of people raising alarms about that. And then, amidst all that noise, one or two headlines about this little island just miles away from this country. There's an entire blackout, just no power. Really makes me wonder what's in store for those people, for that country. And it's got me thinking that I should really take my own advice and go back. I haven't been since the pandemic, but it seems like it's the right time to go. Anyway, I just wanted to give you a heads up. But please remember that no matter what you've heard or what I've said, death comes for us all, and a closed mouth never gets fed. Take care of yourselves. Keep your phones charged. We'll speak again soon.